one of the really important themes in this book is female leadership. And the thing that's unique about the Young Women organization is that we have multiple generations interacting at the same time. So we tell the story of how Henrietta is called to become the president of the first Young Ladies Association.
For me, it's where I had my testimony foundations were built in Young Women's.
Things are always going to change, and I don't think we need to be afraid of that.
Welcome to Out of the Best Books, where we pull a new book from the Deseret Book Library and let it inspire insightful conversations for the curious believer in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm Cole Wissinger.
And I am Sarah Collins, and we are part of Deseret Books' podcast team. The Young Women's program was an integral part of my upbringing and understanding and growing my own testimony, especially when it comes to what it means to be a daughter of loving heavenly parents. And it's also the place where I learn not just spiritual lessons, but important life skills. This program is something that's impacted and influenced millions of women across the globe since its founding more than 150 years ago. And I'm also confident that this conversation that we'll have today, where we dive into more of this topic, will be insightful to anyone wanting to know more about our own church history.
The book Carry On, the Latter-day Saint Young Women's Organization, provides an incredible history of the creation and development of the church's Young Women's program, stories that I have never learned or heard in church before, so we are privileged to be joined by one of the authors of this history, Lisa Olsen Tait. Lisa is the managing historian for women's history at the church's history department. She was also general editor and a historical advisor on the Saints series. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Okay, Lisa, I'm so excited, and selfishly, like I said, this is something I feel, I'm 29, so what does that make me? More than 10 years out of the Young Women's program, right? But this is an important part of our church history, and I think this book is the latest in the church's effort to create a growing body of scholarship on LDS women's history. This book is quite large, and there's a lot to consume in it. Don't worry, it's a picture book in some ways, right? But I think it is important to understand about our own history. And so I'd love to just know, that's kind of my core question. Why is it important that a book like this exists right now?
Yeah. Well, you're right to pick up on the fact that we are very committed to women's history as one of the major areas of focus in the church history department. We do that in a couple of ways. If you have read the Saints series, for example, you will have noticed that we worked very hard to make sure that there was as much gender balance as we could bring to telling the stories in Saints. So we have a lot of female characters. We tell stories from women's point of view. That's what we call integrating women into the history. We also have a very robust element where we do what we would call dedicated women's history, where we are specifically focusing on women, on the women's organizations, on the experiences and history of women in the church. And so we kind of go at it from both of those directions. And Carry On represents our latest entry in that field of dedicated women's history, which, as you mentioned, over the last probably 10 years now, we have published some great work on the Relief Society. We've published At the Pulpit, which is a collection of women's sermons over the years. That's available in your Gospel Library app, as well as on the Church Historians Press website. We've published the journals of Emmeline Wells, the discourses of Eliza R. Snow. So we're doing a lot to bring specific women and women's organizations to our understanding. This book came about, well, we started on it about 10 years ago, actually, recognizing that a lot of work had been done on Relief Society and on particular women, but that there just really was no history of the Young Women organization, and certainly not a comprehensive one that goes beginning to end and really looks at it in depth. So we felt that that would be an important contribution, because Like I say, it hadn't been done before. And so it was a virtually unplowed field, as we say, to go in and just start trying to figure out what's the story here? What happened? We all know what our experience was. How does that fit into this, to a broader picture? And as we worked on this, we learned a lot of really fascinating things about how the Young Women organization, and we could include young men in this as well. And as we go along here, we'll talk more about the history of that, the MIA and the relationship between the young men and young women, but how those organizations, and in some ways, especially the Young Women organization, has been on kind of the leading edge of the church navigating its relationship with the world and deciding at sometimes we're going to be more outward looking and we're going to embrace some things that the world has to offer and bring them back to Zion. And at other times we're going to turn away and we're going to be more inward focused and take a more oppositional stance and try to build boundaries around our community. So this really, it's a history of the Young Women organization. It's also really a history of the church, but through a lens that you've never probably looked at it through before.
That's a really fascinating, and we're gonna get to some of that as well, because I would love to hear just your perspective as a historian. But so you had that experience doing Saints. We see that this book kind of comes about because the church is trying to make this direct approach with a direct goal in mind. How do you get approached to come along, and at what point in the project did you become one of these co-authors, working with a team of other wonderful historians?
So my personal background, when I did my dissertation, I wrote about the Young Woman's Journal, which was the magazine of the YLMIA, and I wrote about the 1890s, so at the turn of the century, and all the changes that are happening in Latter-day Saint culture at the time, and a sense of generational crisis. And so it was, and as a historian, I'm very interested in a generational approach to history, understanding that at any given time, what's going on is being experienced and shaped by different generations that are at different stages of their lives and interacting with each other. And anyway, so I brought all of that interest to it. I joined the department in 2013, worked on some other projects. And then in 2015, along with Kate Holbrook, our dearly departed late Kate Holbrook, and a couple of other women in the department, we started talking about, well, what should the next Women's History Project be? They were just finishing first 50 years of Relief Society and At the Pulpit. So what should we do next? And because of my own background and interest, this was something that I was, excited about, but also objectively looking at it, we recognized that it was a real opportunity to do something that hadn't been done and that would fill a gap and bring an important awareness. And the team went through several permutations. 10 years. It took us 10 years to write this book. And so we brought in Amber Taylor in 2019. And then the next year we brought James Goldberg on. And if people know James Goldberg, he is a brilliant, brilliant creative writer and thinker about writing. And we brought him on specifically to help us shape the story, shape the narrative, the writing in ways that would be engaging, that would tell stories, that would make the book accessible. It's fundamentally meant to be an academic book, I say in quotation marks, meaning that it's a serious book of scholarship with analysis and thousands of primary sources and all of that. But we very, very much wanted it to be readable. And James did a lot to help us with that. So that's kind of the history of the project in a nutshell.
I love that. That's important to know all these great people who not only are in the pages of, in the stories in the book, but then that people rallied around a cause to sort of put these stories out into the world. It's so important. Lisa, what would you say was the most important learning that came to you out of compiling and being a part of this book in, in the perspective of women and the church and church history?
Well, how long have we got? Because there's a lot to say about
this could be the rest of the podcast, right?
Yeah. I think, I don't know. I don't know if this is universally true, but I feel like young women, and maybe especially primary, are just kind of an afterthought sometimes in how we talk about women in the church and women's history. And the thing that's unique about the Young Women organization is that we have multiple generations interacting at the same time. And so a lot of what we are able to portray in telling the history of the Young Women organization is actually the history of adults' concerns about young people. It's a lot of it is the adults talking to each other about young women. And in some ways that's unfortunate, because we wanted to be able to capture more of young women's experience and voices. And we can talk about why that's so hard, if you'd like to explore that a little bit farther. But it also turns out to be really important to understand what have been the drivers of change, of revelation, of developments over time. What were the questions that were being asked? What were the concerns that were being addressed? And this book really takes you behind the scenes on a lot of those types of things over time, trying to understand what they were concerned about and how they were understanding their own historical moment in terms of what they wanted to pass on to the girls, to the young women. So one of the really important themes in this book is female leadership, is highlighting and, as I say, going behind the scenes with women at the local up to the general level, especially, who have been the leaders of this organization over time, and seeing how their leadership has been innovative. It has been inspired. It has responded to the needs and the questions of particular moments. And it has really shaped the church. As I say, this is a history of the church. It's an important history from an institutional perspective, but also from a lived perspective of how women experienced and dealt with those questions and those developments over time. And then as much as we could about how young women experienced and were shaped by the leadership of other women, of older women.
So with that context of like leaders versus the girls, or I mean leaders and the girls, they're not in opposition, hopefully, too often. But who becomes kind of a hero in this book? Are there stories from the youth that you were able to pull, to find just like one or two, even if it's not as voluminous as what you have from the leaders? But who was a hero to you in 150 years?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I think about it in terms of heroes, but there's some really engaging stories and voices that we were lucky to find. Most of our chapters begin with a person and a person's story. Not everyone, but most of them. And so the very first story in the book is Henrietta Lunt. She's 16 years old. She lives in Cedar City. Her dad's the bishop. Her mother and her mother's sister wife are in the Relief Society, and they run the telegraph office and so forth. And so we tell the story of how Henrietta is called to become the president of the first Young Ladies Association in Cedar City. And she herself says, I didn't know what I was doing. I was supposed to teach the gospel. I didn't know it myself. And we had no outlines. We had no materials to use back then. So it's a fun snapshot of what it looked like in those really early days. We also have in the second chapter, and I promise I'm not going to march chapter by chapter.
And the third and the fourth and the fifth, yeah.
But in the second chapter, we have a woman named Fanny Rowland. And she was a young woman in Springville, Utah, who became, enters the young ladies program in the 1890s. And then eventually she becomes the local president and eventually the stake young women president in the 1930s. But she fits into this profile of what we call the new woman, or the new Latter-day Saint woman, at a time when horizons are expanding for women, and there's all these different life patterns that are taking shape for girls. And her life fits into those patterns in some interesting ways. And that leads me to mention that the way we kind of structured the book was to tell what we call the institutional story. So here's the organization and how it developed, and then the cultural story. So what's going on in the culture, both in society at large and in the church, and how are those interacting? How are the developments in the institution being shaped by the forces in the culture? And this new woman idea is a place where that's really clear, that you have this cohort of younger women who are going to college, they're going back east, they're getting education, and they bring all of that to their service in the church. They channel that new woman energy into service in the church, and Fanny Rowland was a great example of that. And then at the middle of the 20th century, which is what we call the heyday of the MIA, when the youth programs are just huge and vibrant and the flagship of the church, and anybody who's older will remember or be aware of that MIA program that was so big in the middle of the 20th century. Our character in that chapter is Myrna Peterson. And we start out with her autobiography that she's writing, and she lives on this little farm in eastern Utah, and how, happy and optimistic, and she's participating in all of these MIA activities and so forth. We did not say this in the book, but that's actually my mother. And we were able to write about her because I had her Treasures of Truth book. And that's, if you read the book, you'll know what that is, but it was a scrapbook project that young women participated in for almost 50 years. And so we were able to go in and reconstruct what she did. And then we went to the local newspapers and found articles about it. And so that was really fun to use her and to be able to see her as representative of this really interesting period in the young women history.
Oh my gosh. Lisa, I love that's a spoiler. I love that. That's such a fun twist that we get an insight into. So going back to what they're labeling this new woman, this to me feels revolutionary, that there has been an organization for women that's lasted more than 150 years. Was this revolutionary at the time when it started? And where does it stand kind of in the context of maybe its contemporaries?
Yeah. Well, as we know, the Relief Society was organized in 1842, so almost 30 years before the Young Women. And actually, women's organizations were very popular, very big. There were a lot of them in the 19th century.
Okay.
So the Latter-day Saints were not doing something necessarily new, but they were certainly very self-conscious about what they were trying to do by organizing women and mobilizing women's talents and energies and leadership to build the church, build the kingdom. What's interesting is that what we now call the Young Women Organization began in 1870 as, get ready for it, the Young Ladies Department of the Ladies Cooperative Retrenchment Association.
Did they have an initialism for that? Could we shorten it with the TL something?
Yeah, they weren't as much into acronyms at that moment. And that name actually didn't last very long. but it's important. It encapsulates some important things that are happening at the time.
Okay.
So this idea of retrenchment is a kind of a movement that Brigham Young is preaching, and he's commissioned Mary Isabella Horn, Eliza R. Snow to lead out in this effort to, as they say, retrench. And that's not a word we use very much anymore, but what it means is to cut back or to fortify boundaries, and it's both. So the railroad has just been completed, so Utah is no longer going to be isolated, and they're really concerned about all of the influences that are coming in. They're concerned about the economic implications. That's where the retrenchment emphasis lands, is for women, is to quit making all these fancy meals and wasting resources and spending all your time trying to outdo each other with these fancy meals. And then with the young women, it's, you know, you don't need so many yards of fabric on your dress and so much lace and so much. So it's about trying to preserve the resources of the community and keep the economic resources of the community in the community instead of using them to buy these luxury goods. I know that sounds really obscure, but it was an important, and as I say, self-conscious way that women could contribute to the church and the church's goals at the time. And so that's the retrenchment part. But then the young ladies department part shows that girls at this time, young women, are seen as kind of a dependent subdivision of the category of women. So the women are going to lead the retrenchment. The women are going to do the things. And then the girls are going to be the young ladies department of the larger women's work. And this is how the church worked at the time. In the 19th century, there's this idea that's kind of called separate spheres. So men are in charge of the public world and certain things, and then women are in charge of certain things. And in the church, the women's sphere is headed by the Relief Society. And the Relief Society is kind of the umbrella or the mother organization for the young women, for the primary, for grain storage, for silk, for all these other initiatives that women are participating in at the time. And so the young ladies are going to be a part of that underneath the women's sphere. What happens is that around the turn of the century, everything is changing. Like I talked about the young women, the new woman pattern. Like this is when young people start going to high school in larger numbers. It's still not the norm, but a lot more are going to high school. And there are just other ways that life patterns are changing, and it's making visible this life stage called adolescence, which nobody had ever really articulated before until about the turn of the 20th century. And so at the turn of the century, then, this young ladies organization shifts from being part of the women's sphere to being part of the youth sphere. And so the young ladies and the young men's mutual improvement associations start working
MIA
together. And that's where we get MIA. Yep.
Right on.
But the point is that the young women organization now joins forces with the young men, and together they are going to see to the needs of the youth, which is just the idea that youth have needs is kind of a new idea. You know, well, they're kind of figuring this out.
Yeah. And to know that the church cared about that, I think that's important. That feels precious to me, that they cared, the leadership cared to boost the young women and put them at the forefront of important society things.
Well, and of course, this is where we get into questions about generational dynamics. One thing that we found in researching this history is that you can kind of set your watch by generational crisis. We're going to have one about every 25 years that we're going to look at the young people and go, oh my gosh, what's wrong with the kids today? And what are we going to do about the kids? I mean, that's that's kind of what the organization came out of in the first place, was the idea of, oh, God, I guess we came to Utah and escaped the world, and nobody thought to provide for the training of the kids. So now we've got to do something about that. And anyway, so all along there are these concerns about generational dynamics. And of course, any religion, but especially one like the Latter-day Saints, where it's not just a church, but it's a way of life, it's a people, it's a community. Like, we have to transmit that from one generation to the next, or we won't last. And so how do we do that? How has that been done? And that's one of the stories we tell in the book, is to show that that's kind of looked different at different times, but the concerns have always been the same. And fundamentally, for the young women around the turn of the century, they articulate the central mandate, the central mission for young women is to help girls gain testimonies. And that's how the organization thinks about itself. That's what its goals, everything that it does is geared around how do we help young women gain testimonies.
So let's stay on that for just a moment here, because this is far before, from a historical perspective, a time that we are in today, where Young Women's is preparing women for missions in a way that they weren't a long time ago. And so I think when you get into the murky 60s and 70s, right, it seems like Young Women's was very concerned with the home economics of things, but it was started with the principles of gaining testimony, and we've found it again in this way of mission preparation. But what was like a turning point in finding that again, where we were preparing young women to learn the gospel?
Well, I think the leaders all along would say that that's what they were doing. But there were different ways of thinking about it. And actually, from the beginning of the organization, and certainly by the early 20th century, the lower age was 14 to join young women, young ladies mutual improvement association, as it was called, until 1934. And that's when 12 and 13-year-olds are brought into the organization. And then there's really no upper age limit. The MIA had classes and groups and activities for people well into their 20s, if not older. In fact, by the 30s, 40s, 50s, they have adult groups as well. And so, of course, the first single young women called as missionaries is 1898. And part of that new woman cohort that I talked about is quite a few who served missions, including Fanny Rowland. And so the idea that mission prep is something new isn't entirely accurate. They were, I mean, it was still much less common. It wasn't the same as it is now, but that was definitely part of the thinking all along. This is where that institutional cultural story brings to bear, because what we have is around the turn of the century, the age for women to marry is something around 22. It's early 20s, right. Maybe a little younger for Latter-day Saints, but it's in the early 20s. By the middle of the 20th century, even though the MIA is still covering, young people, men and women up into the adult years, the age of marriage is about 20, and even younger probably for Latter-day Saint women.
Whoa. And
so what that means in practical terms is that young women is marriage prep. And they are, and they're concerned about temple marriage and making sure that the young people are getting married in the temple, because that's one of the markers of faithfulness and commitment. It provides the best chance, they believe, for a happy marriage and for a successful marriage, and also the best chance of raising up another generation in the church. And so that affects the, lessons and messaging and the way that they think about what they're doing. It's still very much about gaining testimonies, but it's also about getting them married in the temple, which for a lot of young women is going to happen right after high school. And then as the 20th century goes on and we get to the 21st century, that age of marriage goes up again. And after 1972, 18 is the cutoff age for young women. And so that reconfigures how we're thinking about what we're doing, that there is going to be more of this space between high school young women and marriage. It takes a while for that to register, but I think what you point to there with the recent emphasis on preparation for missions and so forth is a really important marker of how that cultural institutional story has shifted in recent times.
I love getting the historical perspective because you're always preparing for something, right? If you're in the schooling years, you're preparing for whatever is next because it's easy to see when there's always a next step to go. But just because we're preparing for missions now and that has a direct gospel tie-in doesn't mean there was not a gospel tie-in to preparing for marriage as well. It's beautiful.
Right. And it was very cultural.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest. Yeah. And, like my mother that we talked about didn't get married until she was 28 years old. So it wasn't and she did serve a mission. So it's not that everyone was fitting into that stereotypical mode of the 50s, although a lot were. And, by the time I was in the Young Women program in the 1980s, it was very, I'm going to be honest, it was pretty heavy-handed about marriage. And that was in large part a reaction against feminism and against the women's movement in society and what they saw as the world trying to, dissuade women, girls from filling their divine mission and so forth. Part of the messaging that we were getting that I think in some ways was really culturally driven, though it was always intended and wanted to be tied to the gospel and to fundamental truths of the gospel. But then this is where the internationalization of the church comes in and change over time in just like who are the young women of the church. And by the 80s and 90s, you have tens and maybe hundreds of thousands of young women all around the world where circumstances are very different. Yeah. And the church is having to come to terms with, realizing that this ideal of getting married and having children and being a homemaker and, all of those stereotypical things, that just simply was not the reality for many, many, many women in the church in the United States and especially beyond. And so I think what we see over time, there's still a lot of that heavy-handed messaging about marriage and in some cases almost toxic kind of shaming of women for having ambition and pursuing careers or whatever. But over time, there's a realization that, wait, that's culture. And what is the gospel? Yeah. And what are the universal things that we want to be teaching young women to help them develop a sense of their divine identity and their testimony and their faith and so forth. And so over time, I think, especially in the last 30 years or so, we've seen a real shift towards those more universal things.
That was going to kind of be my next question is, let's talk future. Let's look to the future. What do you think is important about, having these young women at these young ages learn both kind of these life skills, but really the real principles of the gospel? I know for me, it's where I had my testimony foundations were built in Young Women's with my leaders. And so I don't know, I guess, what does that mean to you, or how does that feel to you knowing you're kind of part of that?
Yeah. Well, as a historian, I'm a lot better at talking about the past than I am about the future. So
Okay.
let me just say that to begin with. But, as you read the book, you'll see that there are patterns that repeat themselves over time. And so, as I said, one of them is what we call the retrenchment versus engagement pattern, where at times in the church we're more outward looking and wanting to, be part of the good things in the world. And at other times we're more inward looking and trying to fortify boundaries and so forth. I think we've been in a little bit more of an outward looking moment for maybe the last 10 years or so. And I don't know what that looks like in the future, but I think that tension will always be there, that kind of ebb and flow. It's never absolutely one or the other. There's always a range and a continuum. But I think, if anything, we're in a moment of really heightened generational awareness. You guys are a lot younger than I am, and you've probably felt it yourselves, how there's so much concern for the rising generation and talking about the youth a lot and trying to reach the youth. Mm-hmm. And I think we're in a moment of trying to figure out the way forward. So in the past, again, as you'll see in the book, during especially those MIA years from the 1920s to the 1970s, there was this huge, elaborate program. It was very structured. There was a lot going on. You did dance festivals and music and speech and drama, and you had lessons, and you were Beehive Girls and Laurels, and they all had their own achievement programs and
lots of to-do lists.
Yeah, and I don't think it was ever the intention to just create a lot of checklists, but I think that's kind of what happened in a lot of cases. And you can see how that was not really exportable to the international church, both because of the size, because it was very American-centric. There's a lot of reasons that didn't work. And then since the early 1970s, when we might call it the wrecking ball era, where we just kind of took MIA and dismantled it and set it aside, and then had to figure out what to do instead. That created a decade or more of some instability and real difficulties in figuring it out. And then we have Ardith Kapp come along, who just is a visionary leader. I think she's one of the most important church leaders, period, of the 20th century. And she gets the program, gives it a framework that's really inspired and gets it back on its feet with this more, quote, spiritual orientation. And now in the last, 6 years or so, we've seen that kind of dismantled. And the young men have dropped Boy Scouts, which was always an important activity element of their program. And so now I think we're at a point where we're trying to figure out a way forward. I see hopeful signs. For me, this is a hopeful sign that the young men and young women are going to be working more closely together, which was the case during the MIA years, but then was kind of lost for a while. And now I think we're trying to find our way forward. And what's going to be the balance between having a more structured program as opposed to what we have now, which is very much not structured. And we could talk for a long time about the pros and cons of that approach. And I think we're in a moment of trying to figure that out now. And it'll be interesting to see. But the one constant throughout the history is change. Even when we've had frameworks like Sister Kapp's values and theme that lasted for 35 years, even within those years, there's always some tweaks and some changes and some adaptations and so forth that are going on. So things are always going to change, and I don't think we need to be afraid of that.
You've given us a great perspective on the history of everything. So as we conclude here, can we make it personal once again? You mentioned Kate Holbrook's name at the very beginning, and I just like to highlight the fact that young women nowadays have so many different kinds of paths to go forward, right? And to see themselves in the future, especially in the gospel scholarship space. Was there someone that you had that helped you see this career path come forward, or even just like a colleague that you would like to give some credit to that help make the book possible and help make, what we see before us possible?
Yeah. It's difficult for me to answer that question. What I would say in a personal way is that one of the most powerful aspects of this project for me has been to see my own experience in perspective, to be able to go back and go, oh, okay, so I went in to young women right during this period of turmoil and readjustment, and I left 6 months before Sister Cap rolled out her new program. So that really puts my experience in perspective. But it's also been really fun and powerful to do that generationally. So my grandmother was a beehive girl in the 1920s. So as I was writing and researching about the beehive program in the 1920s, I'm thinking, this is my grandma. This is what she experienced. And then I'd mentioned my mother in the 1950s and being able to have more perspective on what she experienced. And that really, it brought me closer to them than I had been. And in my mother had a very difficult life after she got married and had children. And it gave me a lot more, empathy and understanding of what her life had been. And then my own daughter, who has special needs, but she was able to get her Young Women medallion in 2010. And so I was able to see my grandmother, my mother, myself, my daughter in perspective over time. And that's really, really powerful, I think. And that's something that I hope readers will take away from the book, is a better understanding of their own experience and of the generational nature of their experience. Real quick, if you want me to mention a specific woman that I really love, there's so many in the history that I would love to give a shout out to, but Susie Young Gates is very dear to me. I'm working on a book about her. She's lived on my shoulder for the last 20 something years. And she was a really great leader of women around the turn of the century. And she worked hand in hand with Elmina Taylor, who was the first general president of the Young Ladies. And Elmina is just a beautiful, beautiful spirit. When she died at her funeral, President Joseph F. Smith spoke. And I think we have this quote in the book, but he talked about how she did not live on borrowed light. She had the light within her, and it was a source for everyone around her. And we only were able to put a fraction into the book of what I saw with Sister Taylor, but I love her so much and can't wait to meet her someday.
Thank you. Thank you for that testimony. Lisa, before we go, is there anything that you'd like to add about this book or the project that people should know about?
Yeah, we actually do have a website for the book. You find it at churchhistorianspress.org, which is where we publish a lot of our stuff. The introduction to the book is there. The full text of the book will go up sometime next year. But in the meantime, we have all of the appendices for the book, and the images that are in the book are on that website. So that might be something people want to check out. And in particular, one of the appendices that we have for the book is called, I think we call it like Young Women Awards or something like that. But it's basically a gallery of all the jewelry from the Young Women program, starting in about 1915 when they had their first necklace. And so, because we get queries all the time, people call us up, I'm cleaning out my mom's jewelry box and I found this pin and I don't know what it is, and, that kind of thing. So now there's a resource where you can go and look at what the necklaces and the pins and the rings and all the things have looked like over time, the beehive bands and on all their awards. So that's something that's fun that people will want to be aware of.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for that addition. Well, yeah, I can't wait to go see those.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa Olsen Tait, for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Carry On, the Latter-day Saint Young Women Organization, 1870 to 2024, the official title of this nice big hardback book that you can get at your local Deseret bookstore or at deseretbook.com. Thank you again to Lisa Olsen Tait for her wonderful contribution to this book and for coming to talk about it with us here on Out of the Best Books. We'll see you next time.